Welcome to Clause 8, presented by TradeSpace, a revolutionary end-to-end AI-powered IP management platform that helps companies unlock the value of their IP. If you enjoy this show, please subscribe at voiceofip.com for updates. Patents have long been the lifeblood of American innovation, providing the foundation for breakthroughs that shape industries and improve lives. Even with all the issues with today's patent system that we discuss on the podcast, that continues to be the case. Today's episode is a reminder of that. Innovators look to the U.S. patent system when deciding to take the leap into entrepreneurship. Meanwhile, universities play a critical role in commercializing cutting-edge research. Research that is made possible because private sector partners are willing to make massive investments they make with confidence, knowing they can rely on the patent rights universities obtain. Ultimately, all Americans benefit from what these entrepreneurs and institutions are able to achieve because of a strong patent system. In this episode, we feature one such entrepreneur, Patrick Murray, who was inspired to start his company because of the patent system. And we also speak with Lisa Mueller, host of the Autumn on the Air podcast, to discuss the world of tech transfer and how universities ensure that their innovations reach the marketplace. Together, their stories underscore why patents remain the engine of American progress. And now, here's your host, Eli Mazour.
Patrick, thank you for joining Clause 8. We share a lot of stories on Clause 8 with inventors who've had all kinds of journeys. And I thought it'd be interesting to share your story because you're kind of in the beginning of this inventor journey, and you've decided to take a dive into obtaining patents as part of that. So I want to talk about that and where you are and how that went for you. So before we get to that, maybe can you tell us, how did you become an inventor?
Eli, first, thank you for having me on the show. My story is one where I loved being around people that were thinking creatively, wanting to solve problems, chewing on those ideas together and criticizing one another in a positive way. And I just liked the idea of leveraging one another to improve an idea and come up with a solution to a challenge that could hopefully help solve problems for others.
There's a lot of patent attorneys listening to this who actually admire inventors but have never been an inventor. Now that you do have patent protection, can you tell us what your invention is and how did you come up with that?
Sure. The invention is proximity-based payments. And when I first thought of the idea, I assumed that someone else had IP on the idea. How could we have all of these payment technologies available to us to make payments via the internet and not have a way to connect individuals based on their proximity? And the thinking being, in tipping culture, oftentimes you're making a payment quickly without having a conversation and you're moving on. The social dynamic around it is to give a gratuity and move on. There's no social engagement. The individual's not in your social circle. And so there should be a way to make that payment possible in the fintech space. And so I wanted to make sure that folks that depended on tips could continue to depend on tips, because when I walk into a situation and somebody provides a service for me, I want to provide them with a gratuity. And unfortunately, there's many scenarios now that don't allow that or don't allow for that to be a comfortable experience.
Yeah, usually it's very awkward, right? When they have a sign and it says Venmo, and then you try to enter it, and then you need 4 last digits of her phone number, and then you regret even starting the process of giving somebody a tip in those situations. So I guess you had this idea, but I'm curious, when you came up with this idea, were you thinking of, I'm going to start a business, or did the idea come to you first and that grew from there?
I frankly assumed there was a business out there doing this. And the idea came, I wanted to explore whether there was any IP on it and found that there wasn't, and spent some time drafting what I thought would be my V1 of a patent application that I wanted to then go and consult with a professional to see whether that was something that they agreed there was a possibility that would be acceptable by the USPTO or had a chance. And then once that process started, I realized it would take a while to work with the patent office to make sure that could potentially be a patent. And in that time, I built what is now Radium Payments and built the business while the patent was being reviewed because I thought there was a chance.
That's interesting. Obviously, I know you personally, so I know you know some patent attorneys. But do you remember when you first heard about patents? Like when did you become aware that's a thing, and what was it's funny, like your mind immediately went to, hey, is there IP? Is there patents covering it? Can I prepare a patent application? But do you remember when you first heard about patents? What did you think about them before you came up with your idea?
I'm fortunate that I've got a number of folks in the IP space in my social circle right now. But first thinking and hearing of patents, maybe middle school and high school, thinking that those were for large corporations that were churning out intellectual property that they were attempting to protect an existing business rather than starting with an idea, applying for a patent, and then building a business around it. I had a very basic idea of patents. Relative to my social network, I still have a pretty basic understanding of patents, but it's something that's always interesting to me because I do think that the unique structure in the United States to incentivize problem solving and creativity is unique, and that's something I'm proud of, and I wanted to take advantage of it.
So what did you think a patent would give you when you started on this journey? Why spend the time and the money involved on all this?
Naively, I think like most, you think it is a pretty robust moat. If you've got a patent, you've got something protecting your business. I think about that in the ideal scenario, that's still true. But I think it's a validator that there is something new and unique. It also shows that as an inventor, you're willing to put in the work to protect your idea, and that essentially that someone else out there that has seen a number of these things does think there's something new and innovative about your approach or your design.
It seemed like you went into pretty clear-eyed, but in terms of you decided to write the patent application yourself, or at least that version 1, what was your thinking there? Like, why did you decide, hey, I should take a stab at it instead of find a patent attorney to do that?
I came at it with no strategy, Eli. One, starting a business, you don't have the resources to necessarily go out and hire an IP firm right away. So you want to do as much legwork as you possibly can. And I started my career as a middle school teacher. And you learn quickly as a teacher that the directions that you give to 30 or 3 classes of 30 middle schoolers, if you're not very clear in the directions that you give, you're going to get 30, 90 different versions of a project. And so I took that approach, making sure that I was really clear about what I was trying to design and build, the idea that I thought I could build, and detailing that out so that any partner or IP professional, an attorney that I was working with, could be really clear in what I was trying to develop. And then I learned the strategies around that, I'm starting to learn the strategies around how you take a very specific idea and potentially broaden that out to allow for additional creativity with that idea.
Did anything surprise you about the process of working with a patent attorney? Like what was involved once you came up with the invention, and then I guess they help you with filing that patent application? Did anything stand out from that?
I think what surprised me was the negotiation that exists, right? You're still dealing with people. This isn't just a process that a computer makes an assessment and gives you a thumbs up or a thumbs down. There is a negotiation to a degree, or maybe that's not the perfect word, but you're working with the office for them to understand. You're educating, back to the middle school example, like you're working to be very clear about the design and the use of the invention so that you can convince somebody, right? And you're advocating, both the inventor and the representing attorney are advocating before the USPTO to convince them of the novel nature.
Yeah, and it's like that negotiating problem with the USPTO. Maybe you could give advice to patent attorneys that have first-time inventors, and sometimes you don't know where to start with them, right? Some of them actually have some knowledge, and they give you a stab at describing their inventions. I guess, what do you think is a good place to start with when you're working with the first-time inventor?
I'll take your question, Eli, and I'll say, I imagine IP attorneys are working with folks that are very proud of the idea that they came up with and are very protective of that. And I'm of the same. The recommendation I would give to a new inventor would be, the goal isn't to prove everybody that you're perfectly right. It's that the goal is to come up with intellectual property that reflects the general idea that you have. So to that earlier point, there has to be a strategy, not to prove yourself right, but to approach a strategy with the USPTO that results in IP rather than constantly going back and forth attempting to convince of of a particular idea that you're actually may not come out with the exact IP that you thought you would, but should approach it to get some sort of protection that you may not have gone in thinking that was what would be the result, the exact invention that would be the result.
You talked about negotiating with the USPTO. Obviously, it's almost luck. There's 10,000 examiners, and your patent application gets sent to one of those examiners. From your experience, what was that process like, which you refer to as negotiation? But you file this patent application, you already know that what you came up with is new, but then you still have to convince that examiner, as you described it. What was that like for you?
I think it's like many other relationships, right? You want to make sure that you have a partner, attorney that one, understands your invention, and two, can develop a relationship with the patent examiner that creates a productive relationship. And so I think misunderstanding, like with many relationships, is a huge problem. And so making sure that you're approaching it in a way that you're attempting to develop a good base for a relationship with one of those 10,000 patent examiners. It's like the advice your parents gave you, just be nice. And I think when you're negotiating with somebody, there's the possibility of frustration and letting those feelings out, because it is a long process. I think just approaching it in a way that this person is one, your gatekeeper to the goal that you want, but also is there to help you get the patent protection that you're looking for.
Did you ever get a chance to talk directly with the examiner during your...
I did. I found the opportunity to connect directly when my counsel wasn't necessarily, I didn't think was representing exactly what we had put together, was able to converse back and forth with that person. And I think actually having the examiner engage directly with me rather than just the attorney helped better understand that there was a person behind that patent application, right? Not just a company or a corporate entity.
Yeah, it's a tricky decision, but I do hear from examiners that it obviously signifies that it's important to the inventor if they're getting involved, and that's helpful. And
Yeah.
It seems like you had a positive experience with that. So you did get your patent, so congratulations with that. And you're building your company Radium now based on your invention. You fundraise based on it. You're talking to potential partners. You said like just having a patent validates your idea, but what has that experience been of becoming an inventor and now being able to share that with others?
For me, I was excited that I was able to become an inventor with a patent. And then I thought everybody would be as excited as I am about the patent itself. I think it's less transformative and more validating for a company. So Radium, every step in creating a company is a challenge. And so as an inventor, you see a problem, you solve a problem. For Radium, our challenge was that we thought, and many thought, that the fintech landscape, when it came to payments, is ground that had been well-trodden. And it is. There are many solutions that exist out there that are solving a huge number of problems. The challenge for us is convincing folks that, one, we're unique and the IP helps us do that. And two, there's still a challenge out there that others have yet to solve. And so for us, that's a compelling reason to remain invested in the business. We're fortunate that we have investors that are also very interested in growing the business. The challenge is, like any other company, and any other company that needs a huge market in order to be successful, right? That's a long and tough road, but we're making good progress.
Now looking back on the process that you went through obtaining the patent, let's say you couldn't obtain a patent, and it's hard to do this hypothetical. Would that have impacted, I guess, whether you pursued this journey or how you would have pursued it? What kind of impact did it have?
I think that's a great question, Eli, and I think about that a lot. It's a huge relief to have the patent, recognizing that the payment from connecting one individual that's in a certain proximity from another individual and executing that without having a conversation with the other individual and then not remaining in contact. You mentioned earlier, you have to scan a QR code or give somebody your email or get somebody's email in order to make a payment. And then you remain connected to them in that Venmo social feed, which is pretty awkward, right? Having a patent that takes our idea and says, yep, that is unique and different, is hugely motivating. I thought it would be all the more motivating to all the businesses that want to come and buy us and do business with us. I think it's more validating for the inventor and for the company to say what we're doing is different rather than make you hugely attractive for acquisition or investment. It's an important validator for me. I think it helps others that are interested in the company see that there's something actually there. To the point of would we continue the journey? I think you got to do a lot of self-reflection. If you think that IP is necessary for the growth of your business and for the protection of the technology that you're building, if you don't get that, you're going to obviously take some time to sit back and reflect whether you have a viable road forward. And so I don't know. I think that I know that the problem is still out there and we're working to solve it, but it makes the decision to continue the path forward a lot easier when you've got the protection.
It's good to hear. Another obviously thing that happens with startups is that it seems like you had like a awesome idea from the beginning and that you're still working on executing it. But sometimes you start with one idea and then you pivot, or you start with one idea and then you, in the process of making your idea a reality, there's other problems that you have to solve and you come up with new ideas, which might be fodder for new patents and so forth. How do you think about that? Obviously, it's not a cheap process to obtain a patent, but I guess where you said, how do you think about, hey, should I continue making investment in obtaining more and more patent protection, or should I use my resources?
I think that we're obviously still interested in expanding the patent and are pursuing that pathway. But for us as a company, we need to make sure that we're validating the potential of the business first. And so it's great to have all these patents, but if there's no market for the product that patent is protecting, then you've got a challenge. So it's keeping all plates spinning at one time, where we've got to definitely grow our user base, get the investment that we need to continue to grow. But then, like you said, if there's opportunity to create a more robust and broader circle around the business, from a protection standpoint, we're interested in that as well. So right now, we're focused on growing our user base and making sure that folks identify with the product and the value resonates with them is what we're focused on right now.
For people, I hope you don't mind saying, you have a pretty busy day job. You're pretty successful, but you went on this entrepreneurship journey, on this innovation journey. Somebody else might be out there sitting there saying, I have a cool idea like Patrick does, and they're deciding whether they should pursue patent protection or not, whether they should go down on this journey. Any advice for them, for somebody listening and thinking about that?
I think you need a catalyst. And so for me, like you said, I've been fortunate to develop a career that I very much enjoy. And I also want to be an entrepreneur and invest in that side. And fortunately, get to do that with my wife, Clancy. The recommendation I would give to folks is if you think that at the end of your career, you'll regret not having tried something, right? Not recognizing it doesn't have to be the thing, but it has to be something. You need to take that first step. And I had some good advice from a friend early on in the process where I thought something that now I think is pretty simple, starting an LLC, was way more complicated than it was. And I was on the phone with this person who's an entrepreneur, Dan Lee, and he said, I was asking him about setting up a business, and he said, if you could have set up 3 LLCs in the time we've been on this phone. And that was a shift for me in thinking, you can't just assume the problem that you're facing is bigger than you can handle. And so you just have to go out and figure out how to solve that problem. And being an entrepreneur is that over and over and over again. And just recognizing the speed with which you can overcome those problems is to your advantage. And you asked earlier, you might start out with an idea that's over in this direction and then shift. That's the same from a patent standpoint as it is from a business standpoint. You have to be willing. Your main goal has to be a successful business, not the validation of your idea. And so that's how I try to approach the work at Radium Payments, is that we're not trying to prove ourselves right or smart. We're trying to build a viable business that solves problems and has significant growth potential.
Oh, that's good advice. Let's say somebody's listening there. Okay, all right, I'm going to do it. I'm also going to try to get a patent. There's options, right? Like you could have filed a patent as a provisional application yourself, which you drafted. You could have filed 10 patent applications. Any advice about somebody considering, should I get a patent attorney at what stage, and how do I find a good one?
Just like any challenge, no one's going to solve it for you. And picking up the line and talking to a patent attorney to walk you through the very introductory pieces of a patent application, I figure, I'm assuming that patent attorney is going to be happy to charge you to help walk you through some pretty basic steps of the patent process. And so for me as the business owner of a small business, I want to, I'm better engaging with that patent attorney if I have a basic understanding of that process, and then leverage them for their true expertise and the strategy that they can bring to your patent application. So I would recommend somebody thinking, if they have an idea, one, do some basic research around what IP already exists out there. Google Patent is a great free resource there. And you yourself give it a grade. What do I think is the likelihood that there's a patent out there that covers my idea? And then try to draft a patent so that you are better formulating your idea and having a stronger, more productive first conversation with counsel when you do seek to reach out to them. Because 100% I wouldn't have been able to achieve the patent without a patent attorney helping guide the process and the strategy, right? It is not just a process, it is a strategy.
I think that's great advice about devoting the time to understanding what the patent process involves. And I think the most successful inventors that we've had on the podcast are people who are like working hand in hand with their patent attorneys and pushing back and maybe getting involved when some patent attorneys wouldn't like, but I think that's what kind of made them effective in the long run. But what about picking the patent attorney? Any advice about that, about somebody who can add that extra value beyond what you might be able to find using Google Patents or some other resource?
That's a relationship as well, and one that needs to be based on trust and consistency. So I think that having a patent attorney that's very clear with you about what your obligations are, right? You don't get to hand over the homework to the patent attorney and then, go on your day. That has to be a trusting relationship where what is expected of you as the inventor, and then the patent attorney understands what their expectations are as well. From me, I've had good experiences and bad experiences. One where I'm prodding the patent attorney on things that I'm seeing notices on from the PTO, and then getting slow responses, right? Like, I don't want to find that information. If I've got counsel, I don't want to find that information out myself. If they're getting pinged from the patent office, I want them to tell me about that rather than me finding it out online. And so I've had experiences where I assume the patent attorney is monitoring everything and keeping me up to date, and they were not. And then that puts a squeeze on us at the 11th hour where we're drafting an update or drafting a response because the clock is ticking. Well, if I had gotten that information a month, 6 weeks earlier, then I'm not struggling to get a response or feeling the pressure. So I think that timing matters, and having a patent attorney that's going to make sure that you're involved in the process. And when they know, that's extremely helpful to reduce stress and make sure that you're responding in a thoughtful manner.
Yeah, and it's obviously like big clients, and they have guidelines about how they want their outside counsel to notify them and all that. But if you are an independent inventor, you want to have that conversation as well with your attorneys, potential attorneys, saying, "Hey, how are we going to get to the finish line, and how are you going to keep me updated about that?" So all of that is great advice. My takeaway, and correct me if I'm wrong, from our conversation is that the idea of patents and the patent system have played an important part in your journey, motivating you to bring this idea to market and have people benefit from that and to build a business about it. The things that you want to happen, right, for America to prosper and grow and continue to be what it is. What advice would you give to most people in Congress? They probably wouldn't be able to define a patent. Maybe they would, but I guess, what would you want them to know from the perspective of an entrepreneur about what patents mean?
Eli, I think it's made me more proud of the American system of innovation, something that I think folks feel and recognize. The innovative culture of the United States is unique. And I think folks can often think, and I think I have thought at times, that it's a given right? It's the culture that we have. But the underlying protection of intellectual property and invention and creativity is what helps to foster that and helps ensure that is perpetuated, right? The reason folks want to come to this country and pursue their dream and build a prosperous life and for them and their family is underpinned by the fact that we as a country invest in inventors and work to protect invention so that there is that motivator to pursue that. And so it's made me more proud of the American system of innovation. And as an inventor, we talked a couple of times here, do you continue to move forward if you don't think that your idea is unique or able to have some sort of protection and somebody can come and take it, right? You want to motivate people. And for me, this process has been supremely motivating, right? And I'm looking for the next challenge.
Patrick, thank you for sharing your story and for sharing your positive perspective on the patent system and what it has done. Hopefully that continues, and we are excited to follow your journey, and hopefully we'll have you on to tell the rest of the story.
Awesome. Eli, thank you again for having me. I'm honored, man.
Next up in this episode is Lisa Mueller to discuss the world of tech transfer and why universities are drawn to the patent system.
Today, we're lucky to be joined by Lisa Mueller, the host of the Autumn on the Air podcast. And I found out today it's been over 230 episodes, which is crazy. An episode a week. People think, IP is some specialized area if you don't know much about IP, but within our field, it's like patent prosecution, patent litigation, and the technology area. But there's some really interesting corners of IP. I interviewed the host of SCP Couch podcast, but yours is tech transfer, all about tech transfer. And it's really kind of like getting an education in that subject. So it's really cool. I really recommend that if what we speak about resonates with you, to definitely check out her podcast and to listen to all those episodes. You get an education in that subject.
Thank you, Eli, for having me. It's great being here on Clause 8, and I love your podcast. You really have some amazing guests.
Thank you. So I was actually getting ready for this podcast, and I said, all right, let me see. I know Google is obviously an example of a very successful tech transfer program. And I said, let me ask ChatGPT what other examples it had, and it actually spit out a list starting with Cristiano Ronaldo. It was a transfers for soccer team, most successful transfer. So ChatGPT seems to need to listen to your podcast as well. So maybe I guess we could start there. When you think about tech transfer, what comes to you? What is it? What's kind of like, why is it important?
I think one of the really great examples of why tech transfer is important, we're almost 5 years out of COVID, right? And thankfully, we got vaccines because of tech transfer and university basic research. Universities, that's what they do really well. They're all about research and innovation and getting that research and innovation out into the marketplace for others, corporations, companies, to take the next step and develop into products and services that can change our lives for the better. And COVID was a really great example of that. We had the basic research on the mRNA vaccines at UPenn, and that got translated out. And thankfully, we had that research, and we were able to translate it really quickly to get vaccines to help solve the pandemic. There's other examples, CRISPR, that has come out of the university system. There's even things like the Honeycrisp apple that came out of the University of Minnesota. Lots of really great things. And 95 masks out of the University of Tennessee. So a lot of really great things that start out in the universities because of their basic research, and then they get translated out to another entity to change all our lives for the better.
So obviously, you were part of Autumn, which is a organization for those involved in tech transfer, and you started a podcast. But I guess, how did you become interested in the subject in the first place?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I've been an Autumn member for a number of years, and every year Autumn has an annual meeting. And it was back in 2019, I was at the annual meeting in Austin, and I was listening to these tech transfer professionals tell stories about what their office was working on, some of their successes, some of their challenges. And one of the really neat things about the tech transfer community is they're very collaborative, and they will help each other out and share stories and work together, again, because their goal is to make an impact on the world. And so I was listening to all these stories and I'm like, I only hear these at the annual meeting. It would be really great to hear about them more frequently. So I started thinking about what would be a good way to tell more of these tech transfer stories. And that led me to a podcast. And I had initially just started the podcast off on my own. And eventually, after about a year and a half or so, Autumn and myself started talking, and we felt like it was better served under the Autumn brand. So then we moved the podcast in under Autumn, and it's been a great collaboration, and I couldn't be happier that it's worked out that way.
Yeah, I'm guess curious, before you even thought about the podcast, what made you want to be involved with Autumn, and what's your interest in tech transfer on a personal level?
So as a patent attorney, I work with a lot of tech transfer offices on patenting their technology. And I learned about Autumn through some of my clients, and their programming, their educational information, what they do at their annual meeting. There's a number of different tracks that are available, one of which includes IP. So it was a really great way to learn more about the IP issues that affect tech transfer, but also was a great way to meet people in other tech transfer offices, not only here in the US, but around the world. So I went to my first meeting and then I was hooked from there.
Obviously you work with a lot of universities. You hear about these ginormous endowments that universities have. They charge a lot of tuition. We know they get grants from the government and so forth. What makes them interested, I guess, in doing tech transfer? Like, why are they spending time on that?
I think part of it is they get a lot of money, they get a lot of research, and what would happen to that research if there wasn't a tech transfer office? It would probably, I don't want to say never see the light of day, but there would be no conduit between the investigator, the researcher who's doing that research, and trying to get that out into industry where it will make an impact. So really the mission of a lot of universities is to make an impact, not only in their local community and their states, but also, if they can, broader in the country and even worldwide. So in order to achieve that mission, when they're getting all these research dollars, the way to do that is through technology transfer. And so that's the reason why so many universities, especially R1 universities, have tech transfer offices.
So for those who aren't familiar, as you are, on a practical level, how does it work? So professor, they have this field of research and then they apply for a grant from the government. Do they make a commitment at that point that they're going to make an effort to commercialize that? Or is it kind of left up to them and their universities?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's really left up to them. They don't have to make a commitment at that point because you never really know where the research is going to go, right? So it might end up that you do the research and it doesn't quite pan out to what you want, or it might be very successful, but there might not be a commercial product, or that might be quite a ways down the road and the reason you need to apply for subsequent grants. But usually what the tech transfer office does is they know which researchers are getting big grants, and they'll check in. They do a lot of education on campus. They make sure that researchers are aware of their office. They do education on patenting. So it's I don't want to say a well-oiled machine, but they do a really good job of keeping their investigators educated on what they need to do and what they need to look for as they go through and do their research in terms of trying to take the next step and get it translated out of the university.
And from what I understand, talking to some of these tech transfer people, sometimes it obviously professors are, I think it's healthy to say, are people with egos, right?
Yes, that I've dealt, I'm sure you've probably in your career dealt with some university professors. Yes, they definitely have some big egos. That is a management issue for sure.
Which I guess is good for innovation because you need that to come up with something, something great. But what I hear from tech transfer office, they have limited resources. They have all these professors coming with them thinking they're the next best thing. But these professors don't have independent funding to get the necessary patent protection. Can you talk us about that piece, I guess, from what kind of you hear, what is like getting the necessary patent protection, I guess, or IP protection?
Yeah, it's really challenging for tech transfer offices, right? Because first of all, their budgets are usually pretty limited, and you obviously can't file on everything. So it's being strategic on what you do file on. And there certainly are, I've run into them with some universities, definitely going back to your point about big egos, where some people with big egos will come in and they want to file on everything. And that does create issues for tech transfer offices in terms of how you manage them. But they have to take good, hard looks at what comes in terms of invention disclosures and make a best educated guess based on their awareness, and also doing some market research to see, does this invention, is it something that addresses a problem, and what is the market size of that problem? Or are there already a lot of different solutions to this particular problem out there, and this is just an incremental improvement? And that's the way they generally approach it. And they use provisionals a lot, quite frankly, and they'll file provisionals, some more detailed than others. And you'll see some of the stats that I've seen that say that only about 30% of provisionals filed by tech transfer offices are ever converted to non-provisionals. So what they'll do is they'll try and manage all these disclosures using the provisional system. And then that kind of kicks the can down the road and does two things, right? Because it gives them some time to do more research and see how the market might or might not be evolving. And then it also gives them a year to see, does this PI come up with more data? Are there improvements? Is this really something that might be going somewhere?
Yeah, and obviously, like Google is based on a patent that was filed by Stanford, and there were other solutions available, but they still did that, and it kind of got them there. And from what I understand, obviously, there's some kind of pool of funding to maybe file that initial patent application that universities have. But then they try to find kind of a commercial partner at that point to cover the rest. And I'm kind of only focused because we are patenters, but to cover the rest of the cost of protecting innovation. Is that kind of how I work?
Yeah. They typically will try and find a licensee to cover the costs for the patent costs. That's generally what happens. And many times we'll do a provisional application. If it's an interesting technology where they're willing to take a risk, they might do a PCT and then wait to the 30-month date and see if they got a licensee. And if they don't, then drop it. Or if it's a technology that they're quasi excited about and they're not sure really if there is a market, they may just not even convert it once the 1-year provisional period is up. It's just patents, as you know, Eli, they're expensive. And for the number of disclosures they get in, and their limited budgets, it's a really difficult undertaking for tech transfer offices.
Yeah, and one thing that I guess I've talked to attorneys and companies who actually work with some of these academics, and now they're inherit the applications were filed, and they're like, I wish, I wish kind of, this is actually important, this is better, and there was more investment. I'm just curious, from what you hear from tech transfer offices, is there any discussion about, hey, maybe is there a way to put more resources on the front end? What do you think? Is there a way to kind of solve that problem?
That's funny. We have this conversation at every autumn annual meeting about the issue with having kind of a fully drafted provisional application to satisfy, obviously, the written description requirements, because that's where you get yourself into trouble, right? If you write a provisional that doesn't satisfy the written description requirements, your priority date is gone. And then if you're talking about an academic, chances are they've probably published within that priority year. So then you run the risk of that publication maybe being prior, or if somebody else comes along, that being prior against your invention. So we do talk about that a lot. And a lot of times, to be very honest, it depends on the size of a tech transfer office. Some of them obviously have a lot more funds and are able to do the fully drafted provisionals. Others, particularly where it's a small office, where it's maybe just 2 or 3 tech transfer professionals, and they just don't have the time. Sometimes it's just a quick and dirty provisional, or sometimes it's even just a cover sheet provisional if there's an impending publication. And that's another problem that tech transfer offices face as well, that adds a wrinkle to this. And we've all experienced it, where somebody will come in and it's, hey, I've got this paper, this presentation, and I'm presenting tomorrow. And so it's quick, slap a cover sheet on it. So there's a lot of different competing factors that I've seen over the years with tech transfer offices. They recognize the need to do better, but the funding is a challenge. And then again, how do you, with all these disclosures come in, how do you decide that inventor's A disclosure is going to get a full-blown provisional, but inventor B's isn't? It's a challenge.
And you have talked to a lot of tech transfer leaders from different types of offices like you described. Is there anything that stands out to you that, like, hey, this is kind of a very successful tech transfer office, and this is kind of how they...
Yeah, there's been a number of them, but I think the one that's standing out to me, which can really, I think, with what they're doing could really make a difference is what Mark Saddam at NYU is doing. He has got his tech transfer team using AI to try and automate a lot of the mundane type of routine tasks for his people in his office, his professionals in his office. And they are integrating it in a very broad way. And what I really like about that is that these tech transfer professionals wear so many different hats: the prosecution, licensing, market research, all these other things they got to deal with. People like us, outside counsel, who are always hounding them about something. So they are seemingly integrating AI into some of their processes to try and take some of the load off the tech transfer people. So what I like about that is that gives them more time to focus on the substantive issues. And I think they are really onto something that could, number one, make life easier for them and help lead to better quality patent applications. And then something else they've done at NYU is they've gone and used AI to go back and look at their license agreements and find out where maybe they've been missing milestone payments or other things. And they've been able to get through 10 years of license agreements in a couple months. And they have been able to reach out to licensees and say, hey, you missed this payment, you're behind on this payment, things that they just didn't have the bandwidth to do before. So I'm excited about what's coming out of that tech transfer office, because I think that could improve quality on a number of different fronts, not only patent applications.
Yeah, and that's just, so I want to talk about like the transfer piece, right? So once, they file applications for finding the partners, you mentioned like, obviously there's like licensing agreements. Can you talk about that piece? How do universities, I guess, find the right partners for these things?
Yeah, that's a really great question. That's part of the tech transfer professional's role too. And that obviously takes a lot of time. They traditionally do a lot of manual kind of research, just searching on the internet, reaching out to people in industry that they know. But there are, like NYU and several tech transfer offices that are developing AI models now to try and help identify targets and potential licensees. So that's one approach. And then there's a lot of tech transfer offices that have established corporations, particularly in the big pharma space, with companies like AbbVie and Takeda, MedImmune, for example. So once they've got these research collaborations going on, it makes it easier for them to find partners for some of their other pharma-related projects. So it's a combination of different things, but AI is definitely helping making that easier for tech transfer offices.
That's interesting about the collaboration that you discussed, established relationships. And we've seen, I guess, a lot of discussion about like alternatives to just classic licensing, right? And obviously there's spin outs, but anything else that you've seen that's interesting in terms of, instead of just finding somebody who wants to just license your IP, any other kind of arrangements that you think are interesting and fruitful to explore?
Yeah, I think I am seeing a lot more kind of setting up these long-term research collaborations between industry and universities. So that's primarily what I'm seeing a lot of. And of course, a lot of big pharma has gone virtual now. They're cut way back on their research. And so they're relying on universities and the spin-outs and startups. So that's primarily, rather than the traditional approach where I think Vanderbilt's one that has some with some pharma companies where they will fund a particular PI, and there's actually a long-term research program with deliverables and milestones and goals that are meant to come out of it. And the pharma partners obviously given first pick at what comes out of that funded research program. So I'm seeing a lot more collaboration leading to licensing and patent activity versus just go out and cold call someone and try and get lucky for a license agreement.
Yeah, and that actually reminds me of another theme that I think a few of your recent podcast episodes covered, is that some of the guests that you've had on, they talked about really encouraging the professors or researchers in their organizations to try to form those relationships as they're doing the research. So they're not just like researching for something that they're actually researching for something that is in demand, that's in use, there's
a market need for, versus something that may be very interesting from an academic perspective, but doesn't really have a real world application. But yeah, trying to get researchers out and make those industry collaborations is really important. And that's where some of the programs that AUTM, for example, has are these connect and collaborate programs where they do connect tech transfer professionals with industry, particularly, again, I keep saying big pharma, but it's really the best example. And making those connections early and then getting some of the big pharma reps in on the university campus to meet with the researchers and starting to establish a network of connections that way.
Yeah, and obviously the big pharma have a need that you described because they rather focus on once the blockbuster is created, and they have a kind of a slim operation. Otherwise, in the other areas, this is much harder. Like I'm thinking like, outside of pharmaceuticals, from what you hear, to find those partners because those partners might say, "Okay, good idea. I'll just do it on my own." Is it hard to kind of form those relationships? And
based on what I've seen, it seems harder outside of pharma. I think pharma is just a low-hanging fruit. It's really easy, but I think outside of those areas, like in the mechanical, electrical, it's more difficult. I think when you start talking software and other things, particularly with big tech, it's a little bit easier, but I haven't heard as many big collaborations, and maybe I just haven't run across them in areas outside of kind of life sciences.
And anything that you've heard of in terms of other successful, I guess, strategies for those in those areas?
There have been a couple on the podcast where some tech transfer professionals have gotten, again, really creative in terms of who they've reached out to. There's one, I think it's up at the university up in Worcester, that had some battery technology that could potentially be a game changer. And it took them a while. And that's the thing. A lot of times it takes a while to find some of these potential licensees. So it took them a good couple of years, but they did ultimately find someone. So they are out there. It just takes more work, I would say, than some of the life science technologies to try and find those industry partners.
Yeah, and I guess some of the successes that I've seen, they've really relied on like the entrepreneurial spirit of the professors themselves.
That's been what I've seen too, where you've got a professor who's really committed to their technology and is out there going to conferences and finding these potential licensees.
Yeah, or starting their own company, or
yes,
and I guess depending on the university and is that a conversation that you've heard about? Like, does the university have the right incentives in place for this to work?
Yeah, a lot of them really do, because a lot of them, their mission now is to make sure they generate startups and spin them out and get them to stay in their local community to try and help drive economic growth. So a lot of them, you'll see collaborations between the tech transfer office and the business school. I just have a podcast about an interdisciplinary course at Sacramento State where they're teaching freshmen all about entrepreneur. It's a 2-semester course. It's in development. And the goal is eventually this would be a mandatory course for all incoming freshmen. And so the idea is you learn all about innovation and entrepreneurship first semester, and then you build a prototype the second semester, and you're required to file a provisional. So you learn all about IP and tech transfer. And the idea is those students go out into the local community there surrounding their school. They talk with people. They find out what some of the local pressing issues are, and then they solve those problems, and they develop prototypes, they develop inventions, they file IP, and they're very excited at Sacramento State. They think that a lot of potential startups will come out of that will have potentially quite a bit of value to solve real world problems.
Yeah, actually, a former guest on my podcast, Professor Dan Brown of Northwestern. He's in the design school there, and they're pushing that kind of idea. And then I met somebody from Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey. He works full-time at Verizon, but he's helping them start up with that. So it's interesting. It's like in there, kind of building that, providing spirit to the students who might not, those are not the traditional schools that you think about.
I think it's important to tackle innovation from a number of different ways. And I think especially when it comes to local community problems, there's a lot of ways that universities and tech transfer offices can solve things right in their own backyard, so to speak.
I think you've had a lot of different tech transfer leaders with different backgrounds. Some are former patent attorneys, obviously, and some are come from a very different space. Anything that I guess you learned from that, from talking to that variety about, doesn't matter what their background is or once they're in the role?
I love that question. And the one that still stands out in my mind is Leslie Miller Nicholson from MIT. She used to be a physical education teacher, and now she heads that office up at MIT.
Oh, wow.
And I've run across several people in tech transfer who have had not obviously physical education, but a non-STEM background. And then I've run into people like Andy Moss, who is now the chair of AUTM. He's down at LSU. He's a former patent attorney. So you have a tremendous breadth and depth of people in tech transfer. But I think one thing that I've seen through all the people I've interviewed on the podcast is you've got people who are tremendously intelligent. They're very smart. And it doesn't matter if they have a STEM degree or not. They're able to pick up on technology. They're extraordinarily hardworking. And I think they're really selfless. It's a difficult job being in a tech transfer office. And they really care about making an impact and changing the world for the better. Because I hear them tell me all the time, this is the greatest job that nobody knows about. Nobody knows. When you talk to postdocs and people coming out of STEM programs in universities or with STEM degrees, whether it's life science or engineering, nobody knows about tech transfer. It just goes to show that there are really amazing people out there who are dedicated to trying to improve our life here on the planet. And they can do it regardless of whether or not they have a science or a STEM or an engineering background. So it's been really incredible to see.
And I imagine one of the things that makes it kind of complicated, the job of tech transfer, is it's actually kind of the government is involved in a lot of areas, from the initial agreements, from the funding piece to the potentially the licensing piece. Any issues that stand out to you, and obviously the protecting the IP patent piece, which we talked about. Anything that stand out to you, that what are what policy issues tech transfer leaders are kind of concerned about, thinking about, and these days?
Yeah, compliance is always an issue. There's some really strict compliance requirements under Bayh-Dole once an invention's discovered, and there's a whole program for meeting those requirements. It takes a lot of time, and there are certain deadlines, and it can be very time consuming as well. I think on the patent front, there's a lot of concern for a lot of different things like subject matter eligibility, the PTAB, and some of the issues there with the serial challenges and the lower threshold for evidence and things like that has been a concern. So I know there's a lot of excitement about potentially some fixes through the Prevail Act. Cost, again, is an issue. We have patent office fees that are going up here very shortly. So, and then also margin rights has been something that has been a concern as well. There was a lot of discussion and press last year, the Biden administration and margin rights, and thankfully nothing happened and occurred with it. But for spin-outs in universities, it made funding at times challenging because there was this uncertainty about, is the government going to exercise or try and make an example of someone and actually use margin rights? Yeah,
and I think, as I mentioned to you, we had Steve Colwriter on the podcast, and he talked about that concern as well, and kind of segregating funds.
Yes.
If you're for, I guess, commercial entities that don't want to risk with that. I want to kind of, it's amazing, 230 episodes. It's kind of crazy to think about. Any advice that you would give to somebody maybe stepping into a tech transfer role based on all the people that you've talked to that kind of stands out to you?
I think my first would be take a breath. There's a lot. It can be overwhelming. I'd encourage you to get involved in a trade organization such as AUTM. There's a lot of really great programs available, whether it's mentoring. There's committees that you can get involved in that will help your skills. One of the things, for example, AUTM has is AUTM University, where they teach individuals who are new to tech transfer some of the ins and outs of the job. And then I would say just keep with it. It is challenging, but you are making a difference. And just take each day as it comes. It will have its ups and downs like any other job, but it's a great profession to be in and can have potential for a great deal of impact.
Somebody might be listening to this from in-house at a company, and they're like, well, maybe there's a fruitful relationship where we can have with some of these academics who are on the cutting edge of stuff. Any advice for them about exploring this tech transfer world?
I think there's a lot that tech transfer offices and industry can achieve together. And I think the earlier they work together, the better. I know there has typically been a reputation that tech transfer offices are difficult to work with. They're slow. But I think that's changing. They are making a concerted effort, many of them, to try and streamline things and work more efficiently. And because I think they see the win for both sides. So if there is someone from corporation, whoever it might be, that is thinking, hey, there might be some interesting possibilities that might come out of a university, a collaboration with a university and ourselves, I'd reach out to the tech transfer office and start having those discussions, because I think from what I've seen, some of the universities that have engaged in those types of collaborations, they've been very successful.
That's great advice. This has been a great, I think, we got a mini lesson about tech transfer. They'll have to check out your podcast to really learn about all the issues that are being discussed. But is there anything else which I guess you want Clause 8 listeners to know?
Yeah, I'm just going to, one thing I would like for them to know that I think tech transfer offices are doing really well. They are also trying to increase the diversity of our ecosystem in terms of trying to get more women inventors, underrepresented inventors like Black inventors, Native American inventors, which I think is really important because right now, I'm sure you're aware, Eli, there are only about 12% of women are named inventors on patents. And I think we're really missing out on a large population of innovators. So tech transfer offices are really working hard to try and get more diverse individuals inventing and patenting. And I think that can only result in really good things for our country and our economy.
And I'm sure we'll see that in the years ahead, of the impact of that. All right, Lisa, thank you so much for joining Clause 8. It's been great talking to you.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks so much, Eli.
Thank you so much for listening. New episodes of Clause 8 come out every 2 weeks, so be sure not to miss it by subscribing at voiceofip.com or wherever you listen to podcasts.